All right, this is Mr. Peterson with another screencast for AP Environmental Science Unit 3. Today, we're diving into aquatic biodiversity and its importance for the Earth. Aquatic systems are really important because they cover about 73% of the Earth's surface. About 71% is saltwater and about 2% is freshwater. So, when you say that the Earth is almost 75% covered with water, it has a big impact on the other 25% that is land. Another word for saltwater ecosystems is marine ecosystems. If you ever get that confused, think of the Marines. That's the branch of the armed forces that is specialized for land attack, but they usually come from the water, and that's usually the ocean. There are a lot of new terms that apply to aquatic systems, so brace yourself for the vocabulary here in this chapter. It can be rather daunting. First off, we have several classes of organisms. The first type is plankton, or small organisms that drift in the water or swim very weakly. There are three kinds. This is phytoplankton, or plankton that can carry out photosynthesis. They're microscopic in size, but these guys do about half of the photosynthesis on Earth. So thank these guys for the oxygen on Earth that we breathe. The plants and trees on land do the other half. Next up is zooplankton. Most of these guys can swim a little bit, but they're still microscopic in size. The prefix zoo means that these are more like animals. And so they form the primary consumer and sometimes secondary consumer levels of the aquatic food web. Some zooplankton isn't microscopic. This is a small ocean shrimp called krill. Zooplankton may be able to move a little bit by swimming, but they can't really move against the current. They get moved around over large distances by ocean current, not by swimming long distances. Jellyfish would be another great example of zooplankton that is not microscopic in size. Next up is organisms that are capable of strong swimming, and they're called nekton. They can move at will through the ocean, against the current, or up and down in the water at will. Plankton pretty much is carried from place to place by water, but these guys can move against the current, and that's what makes them different. Benthos includes any organisms that live at the bottom of the ocean. This lobster can move from place to place, but stays mostly at the bottom. Benthos also includes organisms that anchor themselves down at the bottom of their ecosystem, like oysters and a lot of marine worms. Now, all of these terms before have described the location or mobility of organisms. Many of those organisms are also producers or consumers that make up the different trophic levels of marine food chains. There are also decomposers to fit in here as well, but they're basically the same thing as terrestrial decomposers. Bacteria and fungi play a similar role in the water, helping to decompose dead organic matter and break down these nutrients for reuse. Many times they are found along the bottom. Because most dead organic matter in the water eventually settles to the bottom where it is broken down. And some of the major limiting factors for ecosystems are temperature and rainfall. Those factors pretty much determine most of which biome exists where on Earth. It's different in aquatic ecosystems. One of the major limiting factors in water is the ability of light to penetrate deeply into the water. The word for this is turbidity, and this picture is of a device called a Secchi disc that measures turbidity. The disc gets lowered into the water, it's really heavy, and if the water is really turbid, you lose sight of it quickly because whatever is making the water cloudy is blocking the sunlight from penetrating very deeply. In really clear water, not turbid, you can see the disc as it goes much deeper because light can get all the way down to it and reflect back to your eyes. By measuring the length of the string at the point the disc vanishes, you can get a quantitative measurement of how clear the water is. All of this sunlight penetrating into the water is important because ocean food webs need photosynthesis to occur, just like terrestrial systems do. If the water is turbid, light doesn't penetrate very far. Some other limiting factors include the amount of dissolved nutrients, salinity, water temperature, and how much oxygen is dissolved in the water, because those determine what kinds of organisms can live in the water. But the availability of sunlight is key because it is the source of energy for food chains to begin. Now, there are some very important ecological and economic services that are provided by marine ecosystems. On the ecological side, having 75% of the Earth's surface made of water means that it moderates the climate. If the Earth was covered by a higher percentage of land, the Earth's temperature would rise and fall more rapidly, simply because land heats up and cools down much faster than water. Having all of that water available for evaporation also drives most of the Earth's precipitation patterns, as you can see from all of the clouds in this picture taken by the Apollo astronauts. Another ecological benefit comes back to the fact that the phytoplankton in the ocean do nearly half of the Earth's photosynthesis, so they are responsible for nearly half of the Earth's oxygen production. You can see the amount of phytoplankton that can be present from the picture taken from space. That's the Atlantic Ocean. You can see all of Spain and Portugal in the top right to give you an idea of size. Marine ecosystems also provide habitat for many organisms, as well as nurseries for young marine life. This sea turtle will spend years swimming in the ocean and growing before returning to the beach to lay eggs. The salmon in this picture is in fresh water now, but it spent most of its young life swimming in the ocean and growing for several years before swimming back upstream into fresh water to breed. This is a really cool example of nutrient cycling. The minerals and nutrients that make up the body of this fish were accumulated over years from the ocean, but now they're going to be recycled into the land because this bear is going to digest and deposit those nutrients somewhere on land. Hopefully, not in the water. A major economic benefit for marine ecosystems is that they provide a major source of food for humans. If you remember back to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, BP had to pay out millions of dollars to fishermen along the Gulf Coast simply because they couldn't go to work for several months while the water was contaminated. Marine ecosystems also provide economic benefits because they're popular recreation destinations. Oh, and one last one. They also provide access to many minerals and resources located underground. There's a philosophy in the world called NIMBY, or not in my backyard. Most people wouldn't want an oil rig in their backyard, or really anywhere around where they lived. But fewer people mind if it is located somewhere offshore, so that's why the Gulf Coast is dotted with these oil rigs. The global distribution of non-mineral marine natural resources, such as different types of fish, varies because of some combination of salinity, depth, turbidity, nutrient availability, and temperature. These differences help to differentiate the different types of aquatic biomes, and therefore the nutrients available to use. Remembering back to terrestrial biomes, they were designated by the temperature and precipitation patterns that made up the climate. Marine life zones are designated by more the distance from the shore and the depth clarity of the water. If we think of a horizontal line running left to right up here, the ocean can get broken up into different life zones. The coastal zone here comes everything from where the highest tide touches the land out to the edge of the continental shelf. The continental shelf is the gradually sloping area, but when it drops off rapidly, that's the end of the shelf where much deeper water begins. The zone is much smaller than the open sea zone, which is everything else past the continental shelf. But the coastal zone accounts for about 90% of the species and most of the productivity of the oceans. The open ocean zone is much less productive because there are less nutrients available, because it's further from land, and the water temperature can be colder because it's deeper water. Now, inside of the coastal zone, there are a few subzones. One is estuaries, also known around here as salt marshes. Estuaries are properly defined as areas where salt water from the ocean mixes with fresh water from rivers. So the water isn't salt or fresh, it's a mix called brackish. The salinity can range from nearly fresh water to the salinity of the open ocean, which is usually around 3 to 4% salt or 30 to 40 parts per thousand salt. The salinity and water temperature of the estuary can change hourly as the tides move water around. And the incredible range of different possible conditions opens this zone up to amazing diversity of organisms. There's simply so many nutrients being thrown around, so much sunlight, and so many slightly different niches to exploit that this zone is an extremely diverse area. It's also usually a zone that shelters many forms of life while they're young. If you like eating seafood, and who doesn't, many species reproduce in the estuary, and their young grow up in the relatively protected waters, only moving out into the open sea when they're big enough to handle those conditions. Marshes like these along the coast also serve to protect the coast itself because they can absorb much of the rising waves that hurricanes produce, thus sheltering the land behind them from extreme damage, which is why it's so important we protect these areas from development. Another marine biome is marshland, pictured on the left. This is a wetland dominated by grasses or sedges. Small shrubs often grow along the perimeter as they transition to drier land. Marshes usually form along the shallow edges of lakes and rivers. Bogs, pictured on the right, are acidic, low-oxygen wetlands that form where accumulation of organic material occurs faster than organic decay. Bog soils are waterlogged and acidic peats formed by sphagnum, moss, and other vegetation that decomposes very slowly. Swamps are forested wetlands characterized by specific types of trees and soil types. Another term that describes coastal zone areas is the intertidal zone. Intertidal zones are completely exposed at low tide, but completely covered by water at the high tide mark. Note that estuary intertidal zones can exist in the same area. They're just defined based on different things. And then there's the coral reef, the aquatic equivalent of a tropical rainforest. It's a perfect combination of lots of sunlight, lots of nutrient runoff from nearby land, warm water temperatures that result in really high productivity for the ecosystem. These also serve as a nursery for young marine organisms, but they're different from estuaries. The water is usually quite clear. The water is somewhat deeper, and the salinity is pretty much full-strength ocean water. They're also not part of the intertidal zone, because coral reefs may come close to the top of the water, but they're never completely exposed at low tide. Moving out into the open ocean, you can define the zones of life in vertical or top to bottom way. The top is the euphotic zone. Eu means true or real, and photic means light. So this zone goes from the top of the water to the maximum depth that light can penetrate and support lots of photosynthesis. Moving down, the bathyal zone is dimly lit, so it doesn't support as much photosynthesis. Lots of organisms live here, but depend on the productivity of the upper level to survive. The lowest zone is the abyssal zone, which is permanently without sunlight and very cold. Many organisms still live here, though there's a saying in science that we actually know more about the surface of the moon than we know about what goes on at the bottom of the ocean. New discoveries are being made as technology allows us to explore these areas of the world, but there are still many mysteries that we can only guess about at this point. There are many human activities that affect these systems. I'm only going to mention a few, but it's important that you read the book to get all of these ideas. In this slide, look at the river draining into the ocean at the bottom. It carries runoff pollution from every single house, road, and driveway upstream into the ocean. So, if you have a car with an oil leak and the driveway has an oil spot on it, every time it rains, some of that oil washes off the driveway, into the river, and then into the ocean. It has to go somewhere. Another human impact on aquatic ecosystems is overfishing. Aquatic life is a form of natural capital. It can regenerate itself if you don't take too much and you allow it time to do so. An infrequent but major source of impact on these ecosystems is from oil spill related disasters, such as the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that caught fire a few years back in the Gulf. However, the amount of oil entering the ocean from non-point source pollution, like oil dripping from cars into runoff, puts more oil into the ocean than any oil spill. Remember, you definitely need to read the book to get caught up on this, and you should be reading the book anyway. When it comes to AP, the more different examples of something that you know, the better you're going to be. Now switching gears to freshwater. These are really important, but for different reasons than marine. There are more reasons than what I'm putting here, so be sure to read the textbook to get everything. In this slide, I'm picking the ecological service of groundwater recharge. All the water that is removed from the land by evaporation and transpiration has to be replaced. Precipitation isn't enough. If it just hits the ground and runs off back into the ocean, it never becomes part of the groundwater. So, freshwater ecosystems allow water to slowly make its way back deep underground. This is important around here because even in the deepest drought of the summer, when the grass has all died, most of the trees and larger vegetation continues to grow and survive because they have roots that can access the groundwater. Some other important services include that these systems provide all of the drinking water and our water to irrigate crops. One of the issues with the groundwater recharge is the space being covered by the concrete in large buildings is preventing water from infiltrating and recharging or filling the groundwater back up. We are pumping it up faster than it can replenish itself. Another benefit is hydroelectricity. This is a picture of the Three Gorges Dam in China. It is the largest dam in the world. I've actually visited this one and it is truly huge. My tour guide told us that workers poured concrete for 3 years straight, 24 hours a day, to build a ship lock system to get ships up and down the stream. The area of land behind the dam flooded old sediments that had been there for centuries. The Chinese government had to relocate about 1.2 million people. But back to dams. Dams like these provide about 16% of the Earth's electricity, according to the latest estimates in 2020, but with the major benefit of being renewable and having less pollution than other sources. More on the downside of dams later this year. The vocabulary continues on as we simply need lots of ways to describe different kinds of water. The word lotic is used to describe flowing water systems like rivers and streams, but lentic is used to describe mostly still bodies of water like lakes and ponds. If you get these, good way to remember is that the O in lotic rhymes with flow. Just like the marine systems, freshwater systems have horizontally defined zones as well. The littoral zone is the shallow water near the edge, and it supports a lot of life for the same reasons that coral reefs did in marine ecosystems. Lots of sunlight, warmer water, and lots of little protected places for life to thrive. The limnetic zone is the part farther away from the shore. If you have trouble remembering the difference, I think of walking along the edge of a lake like this and spotting a piece of litter in the littoral zone. Things like that just help me remember which word means what. Now, out in the deeper part of the lake, we've got the limnetic zone that makes up the top of the water column, followed by the profundal zone, and finally the benthic zone at the bottom. Now, there's more detail here in the book that I'm going over, but you need to read that to find the additional details for each zone. Now, there's only one more set of really new vocabulary terms. Freshwater systems get characterized by their nutrient availability. High nutrient availability, think nitrates and phosphates, is going to support lots and lots of growth because plants need them to grow. And that gets the whole food web started. So this lake that is mostly clear water with little plant growth is called oligotrophic. Oligo means few or little. Like an oligarchy is government controlled by a small number of people. Trophic refers to the trophic levels of the food web. So oligotrophic bodies of water have little plant and animal activity just because of the lack of available nutrients. And generally speaking, the water is very clear. You can see down to the bottom 20, 30, 40 feet. On the flip side is eutrophic, where nutrients are freely available to support plant and animal growth. Now, this is a picture of a hypereutrophic pond, where nutrient runoff containing nitrates from nearby farms and phosphates from detergents used to wash dishes and clothes have added way too many nutrients to the water, and the algae has proliferated or bloomed. Regular, plain eutrophic is great because it supports a sustainable level of activity, but hypereutrophic or culture eutrophic isn't good. This is because all of the green algae growing here on the surface are blocking out the sunlight from the deeper levels of the water. That kills plants that are growing in deeper water. Fish in the water may have enough plant material to eat from the top layers, but they die because there's no oxygen in the water. This happens because bacteria in the water are busy breaking down all of the dead organic matter. The process of aerobic respiration uses oxygen to break those materials down. That leaves little oxygen in the water for animals, so the fish die too, and pretty soon the whole lake ecosystem collapses. Because I know you will see it repeatedly throughout this year and on the AP test, I'm going to go over culture eutrophication again. This process goes something like this. An anthropogenic, remember anthropogenic means originating with human activity, source of nitrogen or phosphorus runs into a water source. This leads to an algal bloom that blocks sunlight from reaching the plants below the surface. All the death leads to bacterial growth to start decomposing all of the newly dead organisms. Because the bacteria uses up oxygen while decomposing, it kills off all the fish, leading to more death and decomposition. This then leads to the body of water not being able to support any living organisms because of lack of sunlight and oxygen. A few more terms in here and we're done. When you're driving, I'll bet you've seen signs like this, especially when you get up into the mountains. Watersheds refer to all of the land that drains toward a major river. All of the rain that falls inside of a watershed area will eventually make its way through streams and rivers that drain into one major body of water, like a very large lake or bay. These signs are put up to remind people that everything that pollutes the land here will eventually end up polluting the water downstream as well. Now, I'm skipping a few parts at the end of the outline here because I think the book does a pretty good job of covering them. And I want to remind you that watching these videos isn't enough to get the whole picture of what you need to be learning. So make sure you've read the chapter 2 to finish up the last few items on the outline. And I'll leave you with this slide of an inland wetland, or what we'd call a swamp. That's it for this screencast. Thanks for watching.